Hi everybody, thank you for coming. And first, the shir tonight is dedicated for a Refuah Shelema for NATA, Ben Zissel and BARUCH ben FREIDA, and as always for all those whose health has been affected by the war, and for the return of our Chayolim and Chatufim, the brothers and sisters who are in captivity or who are going through the war effort. In addition, an Aliyat Neshamot for Yitzchak Hirsh ben Eliezer, dedicated by Rabbi Ephraim Naomi Finkelstein in memory of their parents, Rabbi Mrs. Philip Finkelstein. As always, the Finkelsteins were people who had a very pivotal influence on my own life. Finally, we would like to invite everybody to the annual YIBONEH Tu B'Shvat Seder that, God willing, I hope to lead or be involved in. Live music by Chaim David, Wednesday evening, January 24. To register, just send an email to tubishvat@yiboneh.com, and payment instructions will be sent as a reply. You know, even in our Sameach, a regular literature yeshiva of sorts, we actually have a Tu B'Shvat Seder in the day as well. And I like to say that for B'nai Yeshiva, it is the one day of the year that they have a healthy fruit and vegetable diet. So for that alone, it's very, very kedai if you're not so particular on correct fruits and vegetables during the rest of the year. But again, more fundamentally, it is a time to express hakaras hatov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the beauties and the bountiness of Eretz Yisrael, and that's always something. Hakaras hatov is always a very, very good thing. We are in the Parshiot of Yetzias Mitzrayim. We began talking about it last week. And at the end of Parsha Shmos, we have a very, very radical turn in things, where Moshe Rabbeinu was arguing with Hashem over and over and over, and I don't want to go, I'm not worthy, they're not worthy. He's using every possible argument. He says, I'm not good enough, and they're not good enough, and you can get better people than me. And he keeps HaKadosh Baruch Hu in debate for 7 days. He's arguing with Hashem for 7 days. And finally, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm not asking, I'm telling. So Hashem wanted Moshe to agree. Moshe didn't really agree. Hashem says, you're doing it whether you like it or not. So Moshe and Aaron finally go to Paro, and Moshe does all the signs that he has to do to show that he is a shaliach of Hashem. He turns the water to blood, and he turns the staff into a snake, and his hand is saras and everything else. And Paro mockingly says, Mi Hashem, who is this Hashem? Asher eshma bakolo. You get the impression Paro heard of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he's like saying mockingly, who is this God that I should listen to him? I'm looking at my list. I don't see him on my list. I should let the Jewish people go? So Paro comes up with the idea that people agitate for liberty when they have too much time on their hands. A very familiar dictatorial tactic. They should work harder. Then they're not going to have time to think about freedom and liberty and civil rights and everything else. And he makes things worse. He actually says, from now on, you have a quota to make a certain amount of bricks. We used to give you the raw material, the straw. From now on, you got to gather your straw, and you have to come up with a quota. So this actually breaks Moshe Rabbeinu. It's very, very strange. Because Moshe Rabbeinu understood that this would be a process. Hashem did tell him. Hashem already told him, Paro's not going to let them go right away. So Moshe expected that there would be resistance. That's not the Chiddush. But that life should be worse. Again, Moshe Rabbeinu was a person that although he grew up in the palace of the king, Moshe Rabbeinu's heart, his soul, felt so much compassion, so much pain for the suffering of the Jewish people. And the fact that their pain increased and their suffering became worse was unbearable to him. And in spite of the unbelievable madrega of Moshe Rabbeinu, he complains to God in very harsh terms. Lama hareyaisa liam hazeh. Why did you make it worse for the people? Lama zeh shalachthani. Why did you send me? Umeyaz basi el Paro. From the time I came to Paro, not only didn't it become better, it became worse. And Moshe Rabbeinu said it with the phrase, Umeyaz, from the time, Meyaz basi el Paro. Heira la'am hazeh. From the time I came to Paro, you made it worse for the people. So the Medrash points out a beautiful, interesting observation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, you are complaining to me with the word az from then. Chayecha, by your life, they will be redeemed and praise me with the very word that you're using as a complaint against me, and that is the Az Yashir Moshe, that is the song upon the Red Sea, which culminated the redemption of the Jewish people. You complain the Az will be the source of the gratitude for the Geula. So the Mefarshim explain that it's not just the same word, Az and Az, but rather HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Moshe the idea that it's precisely the worsening of the situation that will open the door for redemption. Meaning, we spoke about this last week, that it is the thing that you perceive as evil that in fact will be the source of good. And the Mefarshim explained this in a very, very concrete way, a very, very specific way. The Jewish people should have been in Egypt 400 years. That is what God told Abraham. The Jewish people were redeemed after 210 years. Because if they would have stayed even a little bit longer, they would have hit the 50th level of Tumah. But God has to work, Kavyachal, God has to work within his Gezeros. If God said 400 years, it got to somehow be 400 years, even if he has to collapse it into 210 years. So Hashem has a problem. Hashem has a mathematical problem. How do you compress 400 years of slavery into the 210 years? One way of doing it is unusual population growth, so that the man hours that were worked by this huge population over 210 would equal the man hours of a normal population over 400. So the riboy of the population was in itself one of the ways, bahashkacha, that God could take us out after 210 instead of 400. And the second is the extra difficulty of the suffering. It's hard to quantify suffering, but the concept was God goes there 400 years, which would contain a certain measure of suffering. If that amount of suffering could be experienced in a shorter amount of time, in effect, you've taken the 400 years and you've built it into the 210. So some Mefarshim say it was precisely the incremental difficulty of gathering the straw that created the requisite extra difficulty that enabled the redemption to occur at this particular moment in time. And that's what it means. The very Uz that you're complaining about will be the Uz that will signify the redemption. And that's the way life is. The difficulties in life are often the catalysts for our spiritual growth. So the Parsha ends with Moshe's complaint. And then God begins a musar to Moshe, a chastisement to Moshe, which carries over to the beginning. And he said, I made many promises to the patriarchs, and I didn't fulfill them in their lifetimes. And they didn't complain. And you have no faith. And then Hashem says, Lochein emor livnei Yisrael. I'm sending you back to Bnei Yisrael. And you shall say to them, I am Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei. And Rashi says, I am the one who is faithful in keeping his promise. And then he uses the famous 4 terms of redemption. I will take them from the burdens of Egypt. I will save them from their slavery. I will redeem them with an outstretched strong hand and outstretched arm. I will take them unto me for a nation. V'hotzeisi, v'hitzalti, v'go'alti, v'lokachti. These are called the four Lashonot, the four Lashonas of Geula. Now, I know you know this, it's a well-known halacha, but it's interesting that it's not as clear as you might say. All of us know that in the Seder, we're obligated to drink 4 cups of wine, or grape juice, whatever it is, and we drink it at various points of the Seder. The first cup is drunk after Kiddush. The second cup is drunk after we finish the recitation of the Haggadah story. The third cup is drunk after we say Birkat HaMazon. And the fourth cup is drunk after we recite the Hallel. We finish the Hallel. These are 4 kosos, and this is a chiyuv d'Rabbanan. The Torah does not require drinking 4 cups of wine, but it is a rabbinic obligation. And it's a rabbinic obligation for men and for women. Men and women are equally obligated in the mitzvah of arba kosos. But why is there a chiyuv of 4 cups of wine? So it's very, very interesting. Everybody knows the famous reason that the Chachamim were mitaken the 4 cups of wine to correspond to the 4 terms of redemption. I will take you out, I will save you, I will redeem you, I will take you unto me for a nation. Meaning, keneged arba l'shainis of Geula. But what people sometimes don't recognize is that that's not necessarily the reason. In point of fact, the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara, does not give that as a reason. Insofar as the Gemara is concerned, the only reason you have 4 cups of wine is because there happens to be 4 different commandments that you're doing at the Seder, and each commandment should be honored with a cup of wine. You honor Kiddush with wine, you honor Haggadah with wine, you honor benching with wine, you honor Hallel with wine, meaning it's not that there's a mitzvah of 4 cups of wine. Rather, there are 4 recitation commandments which should have a cup of wine attached. So insofar as the Babylonian Talmud is concerned, the 4 cups of wine are simply because of the 4 mitzvot. Which would mean, let me give you a practical example. Let's imagine you didn't have a Haggadah. You didn't know what to say. Would there be a mitzvah to drink 4 cups of wine if you're not going to say Kiddush, you're not going to bench, you're not going to say Haggadah? So according to the Talmud Bavli, there would be no mitzvah, because there's no mitzvah of 4 cups of wine. There's a mitzvah to have 4 recitations over wine. So the Bavli does not connect the 4 cups of wine to the 4 Lashonas of Geula. The first source that does connect it is the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi says, Keneged Arba Lashonas of Geula. Okay, now that's very interesting, because we normally assume in halacha that the Bavli is much more authoritative than the Yerushalmi, and yet the very familiar source that the Dalit Kosos are Keneged, the 4 Lashonos of Geula, is not from the Bavli at all. It is from the Talmud Yerushalmi. As a little aside, I'll mention another Pesach halacha, whose source is not in the Bavli at all, and it's only from the Talmud Yerushalmi. That's the halacha that you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. Now, some people stop eating matzah from Purim, or some people stop eating matzah from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Those are minhagim. But according to the strict halacha, you're allowed to eat matzah until the day before Pesach. Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to eat matzah because it'll ruin your appetite or your excitement for the matzah of the night. And the Talmud, now in the Bavli, there's no such halacha. If you were to ask me, where in the Gemara does it say you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach? It doesn't say. The source of this well-known halacha that the Shulchan Aruch rules is in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which actually uses a very striking metaphor. It says, anyone who eats matzah on Erev Pesach is tantamount to a person that has relations with his betrothed before the wedding. Meaning, at some point it'll be mutter, at some point it'll be a mitzvah, but if you're jumping the gun, you're doing a sinful action, that's the same thing over here. So it's interesting that there are 2 halachos of Pesach. One is the source, or at least the reason for the 4 cups of wine, and the other is the Yisur of Achilas Matzah, Erev Pesach, which means, you understand what this means. This actually means the Yisur of eating matzah comes in earlier than the Yisur of eating chametz. I can eat chametz Erev Pesach until the fourth of the day. Matzah I cannot eat from dawn, right? So the Yisur of matzah starts earlier than the Yisur of eating chametz on Erev Pesach. And without getting into it, this creates all sorts of problems when you make a siyum for a bechor, for a firstborn, to take off the fast on Erev Pesach. What exactly do you eat in the morning? You can't eat matzah. Chametz you could eat, but a lot of shuls, understandably, don't want to mess up the shul with bread. And potato starch cake and the like is shahakol. That does not count for a Sudas mitzvah. Sudas mitzvah has to either be bread or cake, bread, matzah, cake. And like all of those options don't really work Erev Pesach. So, right, so people come up with egg matzah, but again, maybe we'll talk about that when we get closer to the occasion. I don't know why I'm talking about the Seder. Maybe Tu B'Shvat Seder is making me think of Seder, but okay, but I don't know. All right. So now, let's go with the Talmud Yerushalmi, that the yesod of the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos is because of the 4 lashonot of Geula, Votseisi, V'itzalti, V'ga'alti, V'lakachti. Why are there 4 lashonot of Geula? After all, Yetzias Mitzrayim was a unitary event. God redeemed the Jews from the slavery of Egypt. Why is that expressed in 4 terminologies of Geula? So I'm going to give several answers. Some of them will be short, some of them will be longer, but just in terms of pshat. The simplest pshat answer is actually given by the Netziv, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Lozhen, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and he simply points out, and he proves it by a very, very ingenious, close examination of the language of the text itself, that the Jewish people achieved their freedom in stages. Meaning, yes, from the time Moshe came to Paro until the time the Jews left Egypt was 1 year. This we know from tradition, that the whole period of the plagues was a 1-year period. But the Netziv shows it's not that we went from slavery to freedom in one night with the plague of the firstborn, but rather over the course, Paro was responding in various ways to the plagues in different points. And he says the following. He says there were 3 levels of slavery. The worst level, the highest level, the most chomer level was called avodas perech. Avodas perech is backbreaking labor. And in the middle of the Makos, he shows it where it happens. Paro finally relented and he took away the perech, but we were still avadim. The second level was he took away the avdos, but we were not permitted to leave Mitzrayim. The third level was makas bechoros. We were even able to leave Mitzrayim. So consequently, he says, the first lashon of Geula, Hashem is promising us the back-breaking labor will stop, even though you'll still be slaves. The second lashon of Geula is, even the slavery will stop, even though you'll be stuck in Egypt. The third stage of redemption is you will leave Mitzrayim, and the fourth stage is you'll get the Torah. So the Netziv very elegantly simply says that the 4 lashonot of Geula corresponds chronologically to the progressive stages that the liberation of the Jewish people took place over that year and even into the desert. That first the avodas perech was taken away, but they were still avadim. Then the avdus was taken away, but they were still stuck in Egypt. Then they were permitted to leave Egypt. And then finally we got the Torah. That's how the Netziv understands the Daled Lashonot of Geula. The Medrash Rabbah gives 2 other interpretations of the 4 Lashonot of Geula. One interpretation is it corresponds to 4 different decrees that Paro issued against the Jewish people. And God is promising we will be liberated from all of those evil decrees. Decree number 1 was slavery itself. Decree number 2 was the initial decree that the miyaldot, the midwives, should strangle or kill the male babies. Remember, that was Paro's original decree, and they weren't listening to it. The third decree was the soldiers should throw the males into the water, and the fourth decree was the gathering of the straw. So Paro was gozer 4 gezerot ra'ot on Am Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will annul them all. Now, I will admit there are some kashas on this medrash, and it's simply this. By the time Hashem is telling Moshe about these things, the gezerah of throwing the babies in the water was already annulled, meaning it wasn't an active gezerah anymore. In fact, it was annulled 80 years ago already, because the gezerah was around the time that Moshe Rabbeinu was born. When Hashem is speaking to Moshe, Moshe is 80 years old right now. So this is an old gezerah that's been long gone. So why is Hashem telling Moshe that gezerah will be annulled? Unless it means, kind of, just as I have annulled those decrees, I will annul the present decrees. So that's one medrash. There's another medrash that says that the 4 Lashonos of Geula correspond not only to Mitzrayim, but to the 4 later exiles that the Jewish people will experience in the course of their history. Right? These are the famous 4 kingdoms. The book of Daniel, the Sefer Daniel, is filled with many, many visions of the 4 kingdoms, sometimes represented as 4 metals, gold, silver, copper, iron, sometimes as 4 fearsome beasts. Right? If you look at the book of Daniel, you see a constant reference to the 4 Malchiot, and in rabbinic tradition, the 4 Malchiot are Babylon, Bavel, Paras, Persia, Yavan, Greece, and the final Malchus is called Edom, Rome, and we are generally considered to be situated in the Gullus of Edom, the Gullus of Rome, even today, because even though there's no Roman Empire, because Rome eventually morphed into Western civilization and Christianity, and the Jewish nation is generally subjugated by that. And then there are later midrashim that add, as a component of Gullus Edom, will also be the resurgence of Yishmael as kind of a 5th Gullus, which is the Arab nations and the like. And that's also Merumas in Daniel, because in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a huge statue whose head, Nebuchadnezzar, not Daniel, the Russia had the dream. The statue was gold, and the chest and the arms were silver, and the abdomen and the upper thighs were copper, and the lower leg was iron, and the toes were a mixture of iron and clay. And a huge rock came out from the sky, and it smote the statue, and everything was crushed. Nebuchadnezzar didn't know what the dream meant. And Daniel explained to him, the dream is God is essentially unfolding the ultimate future history of mankind. The gold head is Nebuchadnezzar, and the silver represents Persia, and the copper represents Yavan, and the iron is the destructive power of Rome. But it's not clearly explained what does the clay, right? The expression in English, clay feet, comes from that description in Daniel. But it's quite logical. It's a very reasonable extrapolation that the clay represents Yishmael. Indeed, how do Chazal describe the Ishmaelites? They worship the dust. They worship the dirt on their feet. Interestingly, so therefore the clay, which is from the ground, represents Yishmael, and the fact that the toes are part iron and part clay represents that B'acharit Hayamim, at the very end, B'ikvasa de Mashiach, the heels of Mashiach, there will be the struggle between Rome, Christian civilization, Western civilization, and Yishmael, and the Jewish people. Of course, the common denominator is the Jewish people suffer on either side of the equation. But that's going to be the final struggle. So what's interesting is, Chazal don't talk about 5 exiles. Chazal talk about 4 exiles. We have to be honest. They talk about Bavel and Persia and Greece and Rome, Edom. They don't talk about Yishmael as a fifth galus. But in later sources, there are many sources that do mention that Yishmael will be a component of the fourth galus. And indeed, that's exactly what we have experienced, and l'tzarenu, that is exactly what we are experiencing to this very day. So going back to the Medrash, so the Medrash connects the four Lashonot of Geula.
Isn't it kingdoms, not Galut, because there are only three Galuyot, or two, or something.
No, I didn't hear the what?
There are only three Galuyot, or...
Yeah. So really, we don't mean a separate. Yeah, well, Egypt is pre-Galut. Yeah. So really, it's four kingdoms that will dominate the Jews till the Acharit Yamim, till the end of days. Now, the Medrash wants to say, therefore, going back to the Medrash, that the four promises of redemption are not limited to Mitzrayim, but they're actually future promises. That just as I will redeem you from Mitzrayim, I will redeem you from Babylon, from Persia, from Greece, from Edom. And therefore the four Lashonos of Geula are Keneged, the four Malchios. So we have a whole bunch of interpretations here. I certainly haven't said all of them, and I still have another one to say, which will be a little longer. We have the interpretation of the Nitziv, that the four Lashonot of Geula simply represents the chronological unfolding of how the Jewish people were liberated. That's kind of a pretty straightforward reading of the text. We have the Medrash that connects it to the four decrees of Paro, the slavery, the midwives killing the babies, the soldiers throwing the babies into the water, and the gezerah of gathering the straw. And we have the Medrash that connects it to the four kingdoms, the four Malchiyot, that will enslave and persecute the Jewish people until the coming of Mashiach. Now remember, just in terms of Chazal and understanding it, obviously both in Tanakh and in Chazal, by Gemara and Medrash, this was pre-Islam. So when they talked about Yishmael, they were not directly talking about Islam, they were just talking about Yishmael, and pre-Islamic Yishmael were simply pagans. They were Bedouins who were pagan people. Islam, so to speak, made them monotheists in that way. So we commonly say, Islam is Yishmael, but that's not a complete truth. I mean, number one, there are Arabs who are not Muslim. There are Christian Arabs. And there are Muslims who are not Arab. I mean, Iran, for example, is not an Arabic Islamic country. So the idea that Arab and Muslim are the same concept is not necessarily true. But it is interesting that the Meshech Chochmah has a fascinating observation. Chazal tell us that Yishmael did Shuvah at the end of his life. So since whatever our forefathers do, even Yishmael, is kind of a predictor of what's going to be, that means the nation of Yishmael will also undergo a tshuva, b'acharit hayamim, and the Meshech Chochmah says the first stage of that tshuva, as bizarre as this may find, was their conversion to Islam, because that was a rejection of the paganism in favor of monotheism, and that was their first step towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, granted, that leaves a lot to be desired in light of their other behaviors, but that was the first step towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it may very well be, if I could modernize it, if I could update it a little bit, it may be things like the Abraham Accords of United Arab Emirates and the like, Dubai, might be part of a second stage in which there is at least a segment. I mean, there is Hamas, which is the other extreme of evil, but then there's another opposite segment within the Arab world in which they want to have some type of connection to the Jewish people, and perhaps that's part two of Yishmael doing a type of tshuva. Who knows? Again, one has to be very, very humble in not prognosticating. The Rambam already told us that anything we say about Acharit Hayamim is at best a guess. We will only know it in hindsight. When Mashiach comes, we'll be able to go backwards and say, oh, this was this, and this was this, and this was this. As it's happening, we have no idea what it really is. Okay, so these are different perspectives on the 4 Lashonot of Geula. But I want to share with you a perspective, again, from the Meshech Chochmah, on the meaning of the 4 Lashonot of Geula. And he posits the following idea. He posits that the reason why 4 terms of redemption were utilized is because the Jewish people, being enslaved, faced 4 dangers to their identity. There were 4 dangers to us, and therefore we needed to be rescued from those 4 dangers. And he enumerates them the following. Danger number 1 is danger to our very physical survival. Many, many Jews died. I don't mean the 4/5 that died during darkness, but just in the course of slavery. Babies were killed, people were killed, people died of disease, they died of starvation, they died because of working conditions. So when you're a slave, under any type of slavery, first and foremost, you face risks to your physical survival. So that's danger number 1. Danger number 2, which may be unique to the Jewish people, is that in the course of your slavery, you may lose your spiritual values. You may lose your morality. You may lose your kesher to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We know this was very real because the reason why God had to take us out after 210 years instead of 400 years, as he had told Avram, is because we had reached in just 210 years the 49th level of impurity, and we were slipping fast. Had we remained even the amount of time that it takes for the dough to rise and become chametz, we weren't able to let our dough rise. The Arizal says that wasn't only because Paro was kicking us out. Hashem said, you got to leave now. You're going to hit level 50. And as it were, if 4/5 of the Jewish people died in the plate of darkness, that's because they did reach level number 50. 4/5 did. The 1/5 was level 49 slipping. So danger number 2 is a real danger. You will lose your spiritual essence. Your spiritual essence will be destroyed by the dehumanization of slavery, as well as your constant exposure to the decadence and tumah of Egyptian society that was filled with idolatry, filled with incest, filled with magic and demons. Egypt in particular was a particularly evil, degenerate culture in that particular way. So sakana number 1 is to your physical survival. Sakana number 2 is to your spiritual essence. Sakana number 3 is...
can die only because they didn't want to go out of Egypt, yeah? It's not about Reshaim or something like that.
Well, yeah, but again, I understand that's true. It's a good point, but it's kind of all connected. Like the reason they didn't want to go out is because they had adopted that morality. So in a sense, it's all connected. Now, danger number 3 is a bit more subtle, but it's actually very, very real, and that is a slave, particularly one who is born into slavery, loses a sense of history. They lose a sense that they came from somewhere. There was a very popular series that actually came out of not a novel, it was supposed to be a biography or an autobiography. It turned out to be a lot of it was made up. And this is Roots. You might remember, well, and I don't think anyone here is old enough, but in the 1960s, there was a phenomenon called the Roots phenomenon. Alex Haley, who was a black man who started writing about his ancestors who were kings and princes in Ghana, and they were captured and brought over to America as black slaves, and he talked about how great his family was, how much they had accomplished, and how they just became lowly slaves, and the descendants didn't even know where they came from. And it turned out he made up a lot of the story, I guess, and now everyone talks about plagiarism because of the president of Harvard, but plagiarism goes back a little bit, even back then, whatever it is. But whether it's true or not true or partially true or totally true, it makes no difference. But the point he's making is a true point. And that is, over the course of decades and centuries, you just forget where you came from. You don't have a sense of family. You don't have a sense of yichus. You don't have a sense of anything to be proud of. because your life is just this unrelenting cycle of work. And especially in slavery, it was very common, in all slaveries, to separate families. So parents and children were often raised in different places. They didn't know each other. They couldn't tell you a story about Saba and Safta, Bubby and Zaidi. You weren't even in the same family all the time. So that's a third danger that a person faces. I lose a sense of history. And that's a very important thing, because if I don't know where I come from, I can't have a clear picture where I need to go. Kind of knowing where I come from can give me a sense of direction in life, and a sense of chizuk, that, I'm not a nothing, I'm not a nobody. I have a connection to things that are good and noble and beautiful. So that's sakana number 3, lack of history. And then there's a sakana number 4, which is lack of hope. Over time, you reach a situation where you no longer have any hope that things are better. You become resigned to your situation. And at that point, you become unredeemable. Now, the truth is, even in medicine, at least anecdotally, I'm not sure if we have rigid scientific studies for this, but it is said that when a person honestly has come to the conclusion, when they honestly believe their situation is hopeless, that generates kind of a psychosomatic response where their body begins to shut down irreversibly. Because when you don't have hope, the absence of hope becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you don't have hope, you are hopeless. You are in a hopeless situation. Ad kedei kach that they even say with voodoo dolls, if I'm a superstitious person, and I believe that if somebody sticks a pin in my effigy, the person's going to drop dead, people drop dead. It's like a reverse placebo. A placebo is, if I think it's going to work, maybe it'll work. If I think it's going to kill me, it's going to kill me. Right? The body will react that particular way. So over so many years, Jews lack hope. And when you lack hope, you have nothing. You can't go on. You don't have the energy to make the move that you have to make. In fact, that might be why the 4/5 didn't want to go. They just said, this is it. So the Meshech Chochmah says that the 4 Lashonot of Geula are because of the 4 dangers the Jewish people faced. Dangers to their physical survival, dangers to their spiritual essence, a loss of history, and a lack of hope, an absence of hope. Now, he now takes the analysis further in a fascinating way. In Kabbalah, we have a well-known term called Isarusa Dilatata, Isarusa Doliela. This is just Aramaic. Isarusa means an arousal. And Isarusa Doliela means an arousal from above. Isarusa Dilatata means an arousal from below. So there's a fundamental concept in Kabbalah that in order to elicit certain responses from above, there has to be a response from below. I start something here, and that opens the gates of heaven. Now, God meets me more than halfway. In fact, the Talmud has a famous expression. Hashem says, open for me the eye of a needle, and I will open up for you the expanse of the gates of the Beit HaMikdash. So it's not that I got to do 50% and then God does the other 50%. I got to do, 0.11%. Then Hashem will do 99.9, whatever it would be. But it got to start with me. There has to be a hisorurus. Right? Isarusa, hisorurus milmata, that brings the hisorurus lamaila. So the Meshech Chochmah says, if it is true that the Jewish people faced 4 dangers from which they had to be redeemed, what was their corresponding behavior that elicited the divine response? So here he identifies it in a passage from the Mechilta. I mentioned part of the Mechilta last week. Right? Chazal talk about the fact that even though the Jewish people were on the 49th level of Tumah, there were certain merits that they had. And the merits appear in different lists, and not all of them are the same. But the Meshech Chochmah is going to work, and that's what I'm going to work with too, with the list as it appears in the Mechilta. And the Mechilta says, these were the 4 merits that kept the Jewish people from sinking, 1/5 of the Jewish people from sinking into the 50th level of Tumah. He says, number 1, they didn't intermarry. They remained faithful. Husband and wives remained faithful to each other. That's why Rashi brings, there was only one recorded instance of a Jewish woman being unfaithful to her husband, and even that may have been a mistaken identity. The Jewish people were gedurim ba'arayos. They were faithful in their marriage commitments. That's number 1. Number 2, it says, they did not speak lashon hara against each other. Now let me explain what that means. That does not mean they were from and they were studying the Chafetz Chaim. It really means, this is really a matter of law, meaning it could be that vis-a-vis each other they were gossiping. But it means they didn't turn against each other to the authorities. Meaning, if you go back to more recent history, go back to the Holocaust. So one of the tragedies of the Holocaust, superimposed on the tragedy of 6 million deaths, obviously, but superimposed on that was the fact that sometimes, Baruch Hashem, I'm not going to say a lot of times, but clearly there were some occasions where Jews were collaborators with the Nazis. And, they did it, maybe I can't say it, they did it for the best of reasons. I mean, they did it to save their lives, they did it to save their children, they did it to try to squeeze out some little bit of opportunity. Most of the time they were killed at the end anyway. But they turned against their fellow Jews in order to get some real or imaginary advantage. When Chazal say they didn't speak lashon hara, it's not a from thing, I don't speak lashon hara. It means they didn't turn against each other to get temporary advantages. And that is why Chazal tell us, or actually not Chazal, the Chumash mentions, that the taskmasters were beaten, the Jewish taskmasters were beaten when slaves didn't meet their quotas. And the Medrash explains that the Egyptians wanted to know, give us the names of the guys that were shirkers. The taskmasters wouldn't give in. And they got beaten. They took beatings. And by the way, this is fascinating. Who were these righteous taskmasters who were willing to get beaten? Dasan and Avira, the big troublemakers who made Moshe's life miserable and died with Korach. That's right. You might wonder sometimes, how did these guys make the cut? 4/5 of the Jewish people died. Dasan and Avira get to leave Mitzrayim? Yeah, they get to leave Mitzrayim. They were willing to be beaten. In fact, although I'm just speculating as amateur psychologist, I actually think this is why David Dasan and Avir had such resentment to Moshe Rabbeinu. Here, Moshe Rabbeinu grew up in the house of the king, then he goes away for around 40 years, shows up, takes over, becomes the great liberator. When Dasan and Avir saying, we were here all these years, we're getting beaten, we're getting tortured, we're getting suffering, we showed our loyalty, we paid our dues. Yeah, maybe I'm too humanizing this, but I don't know, I have a gut reaction that maybe that what was going on. Dasan and Aviram were committed to the Jewish people in a very real way. And then this outsider shows up and kind of takes over the show. Okay, again, you can accept it or not, but I think it's an interesting possibility to look at. The one thing that's indisputable is Dasan and Aviram made the 1/5 cut. That's the one thing we know for sure. So they must have had some zechus. Again, zechus number 1, they were faithful in their marriage. Zechus number 2, they did not speak lashon hara, which I'm interpreting to mean the loyalty to each other. Don't turn your friend in to get some advantage. Then merit number 3, this is from the Mechilta, is they kept Lashon HaKodesh. They spoke the Hebrew language. They didn't go into the Egyptian language. They probably understood it, but the language of the family was Lashon HaKodesh. And number 4, one second, I'm talking because there are different lists on names. They didn't change their names, that's correct. Yeah, so the Mechilta mentions faithfulness in marriage, not speaking Lashon Hara, not changing their names, that's the first one, and not changing their language. Now I know that there are other lists that talk about not changing their clothing. There are other lists, but this is the list of the Mechilta. And you're correct, there are other lists of 4. So here's what the Meshech Chochmah says very, very nicely. The Meshech Chochmah says, the 4 behaviors of the Jewish people are the isarusa delatata. It is the arousal from below that will protect them against the 4 dangers. Meaning each one of these behaviors is something that can immunize you and protect you from one of the 4 dangers. How is that so? So let's take first, so it's going to be in a different order, but let's take first the danger to my body, the danger to my guf, the danger to my physical survival. The greatest thing that protects Am Yisrael from physical dangers is the unity and the achdus that we have. The old story, united we stand. When Klal Yisrael is bi'achdus, God gives them the ability to withstand the enemies that want to destroy them. Or as Thomas Paine said, and I think I mentioned it last week, we must all hang together, for otherwise we shall surely hang separately. He said that during the American Revolution. So, the not speaking Lashon Hara, which we have interpreted to mean the group solidarity, that we're going to have a united front, we're not going to break ranks so individual people will get special favors. That is what kept us physically alive. Because that achdus guarantees our physical survival as a nation. Right? So therefore, the hisorus milmata that was matzil us from the physical danger was the lo dibru lashon hara. Now, the second danger we mentioned was danger to my spiritual values. I get coarsened. I get diminished. I lose a spiritual connection to Hashem. What behavior allowed me to at least remain above water? 49th level to be sure, but at least above the morass of the 50th level. Faithfulness to marriage. The Meshech Chochmah points out that marriage is called kiddushin, sanctification, holiness. It is in the relationship of husband and wife that the Shekhinah is present. And that is why a Jewish home is called a mishkan, a tabernacle. Because when there is shalom between ish ve'isha, God's presence is there. And as corrupt and as debasing and as degenerate as Egyptian society was, when the slave went into his hovel and sat down with his wife over a piece of bread or whatever it is they ate, that was the residual kedusha that stopped them from sinking to the 50th level. So the lo dibru lashon hara is the isarusa dolatata to a physical danger. The faithfulness to the marital relationship was the kedusha that kept us spiritually going. Again, not great. We were on the 49th level, but at least it gave us something. Then, not changing names. So here, the Meshech Chochmah makes a point that may be a little anachronistic, but this is what he says. He says, the minhag of Klal Yisrael is that you always name after ancestors. So when you name a child after a babi, after a zaidi, sava, savta, or after a biblical figure, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Esther, Devorah, Rachel, Rivka, that gives a person a sense of history. That shows I come from somewhere. I come from an Avram, I come from a Sarah, I come from a Yitzchak, a Rivka, a Devorah, an Esther. I have a sense of history. I'm not simply somebody born out of nothing. And by the way, even if a person is a ger, even if they're of non-Jewish origin, number one, they can still take pride in their history. Whatever. I mean, I know, for example, gerim who come from ancestors who did much good for the Jewish people. And even if they didn't do good for the Jewish people, they may have done good for the world. But that's a sense of history. You connect yourself to the past. You know, in Yiddish, you see this very beautifully. You know, in Yiddish, we have these different diminutives for children. We call them bubula, mamala, tatala. So sometimes people don't think about it. They just use it interchangeably. You call the kid bubula. But no, that doesn't really make sense. Bubula means little bubby, little grandmother. Mamala means little mother. In other words, the concept was you named a child after a grandparent, and you didn't, in honor of the grandparent, you didn't want to use the name, but you called the child, you're my little grandfather, you're my little mother, my little father, right? And the child, if the child can internalize that, they know, oh yeah, I'm kind of, you know, I'm your mommy, I'm your daddy, I'm your grandmother, I'm your grandfather. See? I'm connected to that. I come from something. So the preservation of names was very, very important because it gave them a sense of history. Finally, the fourth sakana was lack of hope. So here the Medrash Chachma says very beautifully, retaining the Hebrew language is a great affirmation of hope that the Galut will not be forever. Think about that. There are quite a few languages. We actually know the language. We have dictionaries, but they're extinct. They're not spoken anywhere. Nobody speaks Hittite. Nobody speaks Assyrian, even though we do have Hittite dictionaries and Assyrian dictionaries. Even Latin. Latin, at one point, was the most widely spoken language of the world. It was the language of the Roman Empire. Latin. Now, and even in America, it used to be Latin was required, I think in Israel as well. Latin was required for legal education, for medicine. Even today, certain prescription terms are based on Latin, even though Latin is not a required language anymore. In Harvard, in the days of Harvard's greatness, I don't know if they've lost it or not, it used to be that you had to take 3 classical languages: Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And for many years, I think they stopped it in the 1950s, there had to be a valedictorian address in Hebrew, even by a non-Jew. You know, people like Thomas Jefferson, you know, knew Hebrew. Again, I can't say how absolutely fluent they were, but you know, Jefferson probably was fluent. But you know, Jefferson, you know, had a copy of the Talmud in his library. You know, things like that. So. But languages like Latin are extinct. Even the Catholic Church, which was the last bastion of Latin, does not use Latin in the Mass. I mean, there are some Haredi Catholics who broke away from the Pope. They're called Old Catholics, and they keep Latin. But they're kind of crazy. The Pope excommunicated them. They're put in cherem. The official policy of the Catholic Church is you don't have to conduct prayers in Latin. And the reason is a language becomes extinct if you no longer have a culture that uses the language. So, here we are languishing in Egypt, and we're slaves, and it's decade after decade after decade. Why am I teaching my kid Hebrew? If we're gonna be here forever and ever, what is the purpose of this language? So what is a parent telling a child when in the middle of the slavery, I'm teaching the child Lashon HaKodesh? I am telling the child, we are slaves in this land right now, but we're not going to be slaves forever. There's going to come a time, I don't know if it's in your lifetime or my lifetime. Maybe it'll be after we're dead. Maybe it'll be your children or your children's children. But there's going to come a time we're going to leave here. And there's going to come a time we're going to go to our own land. And there's going to come a time when we will have, remember this is before, I'm not talking about what, this is before Moshe came. This is the years of slavery they were doing this. Okay, it's not after Moshe comes and does the plagues. All those dark years, those hopeless years, parents are communicating to their child, have hope, have courage, know that this is not where we're going to be forever. Maybe not in your lifetime and not in my lifetime, but there will come. So you see what the Meshech Chochmah is doing. 4 Lishonot of Geula, because of 4 dangers. And God redeemed us from 4 dangers. But in order for God to redeem us from the 4 dangers, we had to have 4 behaviors that represent the arousal from below to trigger the arousal from above. The physical danger we faced, we countermanded by not speaking Lashon Hara. The spiritual dangers we face, we countered by the faithfulness in our marriage vows, the Kedusha of the marriage. The lack of history and roots, we countered that with keeping names that connected us to the past. And the hope that the future will be different by preserving lovingly Lashon HaKodesh, which is that it's not just remembering our past, but it's affirming a tikva, affirming a future in an eventual redemption. So we have 4 Lishonot of Geula, 4 dangers, 4 behaviors to be the hisorut, the arousal from below. So the final point, so it's actually 4 groups of 4. There's a 4th group of 4, and that is, the Meshech Chochmah says, this explains the positioning of the 4 cups in the Seder. Kos Rishon of the Seder. Again, the order is not going to be the same, but these 4 ideas will be there. The first cup of the Seder is called the cup of Kiddush. Kiddush is indeed the same word as Kiddushin, marriage, and that is a celebration of the sanctity of the Jewish home. And therefore that reminds us that it was the Kedusha of the Bayis that preserved us spiritually. The second cup is on the Magid. Now the Magid is the historical narrative of the Jewish people. That connects us to the past. So that's similar to not changing the names, which is your connection to the past. History. The third cup is Birkat HaMazon. Now this is a bit more subtle, but everyone understands that the foundational yesod of Birkat HaMazon is Hakarat HaTov, gratitude to God. And gratitude is actually a very important component of unity. Why is that so? Because so much disunity comes from rivalry and jealousy. And I begrudge your good fortune. But when I'm sameach b'chelki, when I rejoice in what Hashem gave me, there I can be unified. I can be happy in your achievements and your possessions because I'm happy with mine. So Birkat HaMazon, which fosters Hakaras HaTov, creates unity, and that corresponds to what saved us physically. And of course, Birkat HaMazon is about physical food. And that corresponds to the not speaking Lashon Hara. You see? And the final point is Hallel. Now, you'll remember from the Seder that the Hallel of the Seder night is divided, is bifurcated. We say a little bit of the Hallel before the meal, and then we say a majority of the Hallel after the meal. And the Rishonim explain that the Hallel before the meal is thanking God about Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's past-oriented. That's why it's connected to Magid. But the Hallel after the meal is no longer focused on Yetziat Mitzrayim. It is focused on the future redemption. That is why, what do you do right before that Hallel? You open the door for Eliyahu Hanavi, who announces Mashiach. So what is the 4th cup? Hope. And that corresponds to teaching the Hebrew language and the notion of not giving up. So we have this beautiful, intricate tapestry. We have 4 terms of redemption because of 4 dangers, which were countermanded by 4 behaviors that find their expression in the 4 cups of the Pesach Seder. right? This is kind of an elaboration of the Meshech Chachma's thoughts on the 4 kosot. So, B'ezrat Hashem, even though it's not Pesach now, but as I mentioned last week, during these weeks of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the light of Pesach is actually shining, at least in microcosm now, and we could benefit from the spiritual redemption that Hashem makes available. So, thank you and have a Shabbat Shalom.